Most welcome, Mr. Richard, on the show. Please share your in-depth opinions about corn industry destruction in America.
Imagine for a moment that 94% of America's corn exports to our most important, most reliable buyers simply vanished. Not over a decade, but in the span of just 6 months. Think about the scale of that collapse. This wasn't because of a biblical drought that turned the fields to dust. It wasn't caused by an unstoppable plague of insects devouring the harvest. No, this catastrophe was authored by a simple invoice, a piece of paper, conceived and printed in Washington, D.C. As we speak, Canadian grain ships are racing across the Pacific Ocean, their holds full, their contracts signed and secured at a premium, and back here at home, from the agricultural heart of Iowa to the fertile fields of Indiana, U.S. grain elevators are jammed to capacity, literally overflowing with millions of bushels of corn that nobody anywhere seems to want. Tonight, we are going to track, step by painstaking step, exactly how a self-declared America First tariff blitz ended up slicing the very heart out of American agriculture, leaving our farmers reeling and our rural economies in tatters. Let's start by looking at the raw, undeniable numbers. In January of 2025, a bushel of U.S. corn was a valuable commodity on the global market, fetching a respectable $4.90. Farmers could plan around that number. They could make a living. But by July, that price had plunged to just $3.50. And it didn't just dip, it hit the floor and stayed there, stubbornly rooted in place, a constant grim reminder of the new reality. Now, travel just across the border to Canada. While American farmers were staring at that $3.50 number with dread, Canadian corn was closing sales at $4.20, $4.30, even $4.50 a bushel. They were getting $1 more per bushel, and it wasn't by accident. This premium was thanks to their innovative new carbon-traced contracts, particularly with Japanese buyers who were willing to pay more for sustainability. That significant price gap isn't some random act of international goodwill. It is the direct result of a tariff wedge that Washington hammered right into the middle of the North American market. When the administration slapped a sweeping 25% duty on virtually all Canadian goods except energy, a move they claimed was about border control and bringing back manufacturing, they started a fire. Ottawa's response was swift and decisive. Within 48 hours, they matched those tariffs, targeting $20 billion of U.S. goods. And then they rapidly scaled that up to an almost unimaginable $106 billion. Corn, soybeans, whiskey, tractors, anything and everything shipped north became instantly prohibitively expensive. The core assumption in D.C. was that Canada needed our markets far more than we could ever need theirs. That high-stakes political wager overlooked two critical, game-changing facts. First, for the previous 5 years, Canada had been meticulously diversifying its export routes under the Trans-Pacific Trade Deal, cultivating new relationships and building new pathways to market that bypassed the U.S. entirely. Second, and perhaps more importantly, major Asian buyers, especially in Japan and South Korea, were becoming desperate for reliable, low-carbon grain. Canada, through a combination of government support and private innovation, had just finished building a sophisticated blockchain-verified supply chain designed to deliver precisely that, offering a level of transparency and sustainability the U.S. couldn't match. Once the American tariffs landed, U.S. corn was instantly priced out of contention. Canadian product, now with a clear political and sustainability advantage, simply stepped in to fill the void. Market share that took the American Midwest 40 hard-won years to conquer evaporated in a single quarter. Most people, when they picture a tariff, imagine a simple charge at the border, a flat fee added at the port. But out here in the real economy, we learned the hard way that a tariff is far more insidious. It's more like a virus. It doesn't just hit once. It creeps into every single invoice, infecting every single step of the supply chain, multiplying costs along the way. For instance, Washington also decided to levy fees on Chinese-owned vessels that were hauling U.S. corn out of the Gulf of Mexico. It was a political statement, but with real-world consequences. Overnight, freight costs for our own exports climbed by a brutal 25%, tacking an additional $930 million onto annual export costs. That's nearly $1 billion in new costs just to get our product from the dock to the buyer. Then came the bureaucratic warfare, pesticide residue rules, technical standards that had been harmonized and operating smoothly between the U.S. and Canada for years, were suddenly weaponized. New complex lab testing protocols were rushed onto the books, but without any funding for extra capacity to actually handle the new workload. This bureaucratic bottleneck pushed inspection fees up by a crippling 40%. When the understaffed labs couldn't possibly keep pace, the inevitable happened. 2 million tons of perfectly good, safe American corn were turned away at the border. Not for being contaminated, but for having late paperwork. Think about the sheer waste, the inefficiency, the calculated absurdity of that. And then the virus hit home, infecting the very inputs farmers need to grow a crop. American growers import over a third of their potash, a crucial fertilizer nutrient, from Canadian mines. The tariffs yanked those prices up by a brutal 15 to 25%, with the new price lists arriving just as farmers were placing their orders for spring planting. Consider a 1,000-acre farmer in central Illinois. Last year, he paid $180 per ton for his potash. This April, he got a quote for $230. That's an extra $50 for every ton, a $50,000 hit to his bottom line before he even plants a single seed. And here's the cruelest part of the trap. He cannot pass that increase along to his customers. Why? Because as we've already seen, the export price of his corn has utterly collapsed. Do you see the brutal squeeze? Costs are exploding, prices are plummeting, and there is absolutely no relief in sight. These numbers, as cold and abstract as they can seem, ultimately bleed people. I want to introduce you to Doug Reeder, a fourth-generation corn grower in Cedar Rapids. In 2024, Doug did everything right. He's a smart operator. He hedged 40% of his anticipated crop at $4.60 a bushel, a conservative price, just enough to cover his seed, his fuel, and his cash rent for the land he farms. When the trade war detonated and the futures market sank to $3.48, Those hedges saved some of his equity. They kept the bank from calling his loan immediately. But the rest of his grain, the unhedged 60%, now sits in vast, silent metal bins on his property. It's costing him 4 cents a bushel every single month, just for the electricity to run the fans and keep it from spoiling. Doug's lender, seeing the financial storm on the horizon, just rolled his operating note over for the second time. And then he made a chilling request. He asked for additional collateral to secure the loan, his wife's retirement land, a piece of ground that had been in her family for a century. Just 30 miles down the road from Doug's farm, an ethanol plant, a facility that was the cornerstone of the local economy, annually buying 42 million bushels of corn from farmers, just like Doug went idle in May. 63 workers, good people with families and mortgages, were simply told not to come back. Now multiply that single story across the entire Midwest. Picture the rail sidings packed with empty hopper cars that once carried prosperity to market. Picture the implement dealers reporting zero planter sales for the fall season. Picture the small town diners where the daily special used to sell out by noon, now closing their doors in the early afternoon for a sheer lack of customers. The data tells the same story. Rural unemployment in 10 of the most corn-dependent counties jumped from a healthy 3.1% to a devastating 6.8% between March and July alone. Let's be perfectly clear. That is not a dip. It is a localized depression. It is a slow motion crisis unfolding in our fields and towns, affecting real lives and destroying real communities. So, the unavoidable question is, how did Canada, a nation with a shorter growing season, a tougher climate, and generally higher labor costs, manage to run the table and so completely seize this market opportunity? It wasn't luck. It wasn't weather. It was deliberate long-term strategy. For years, Ottawa had been smartly subsidizing research into low-carbon corn varieties. They then meticulously matched those sustainability claims with a robust field-to-vessel tracking system built on blockchain technology. This sophisticated system provided the exact kind of transparency and verifiable data that high-value European and Japanese buyers now increasingly require. It gave Canadian corn a premium, verifiable edge that had nothing to do with price. They also moved strategically on logistics, signing long-term shipping agreements through the Pacific ports of Vancouver and Prince Rupert gateways that were never touched by the Gulf of Mexico vessel tariffs that crippled U.S. exports. But most importantly, Canada kept its politics predictable. When Washington began making noise about potentially doubling the tariffs midsummer, it injected a massive dose of uncertainty into the market. Buyers from Seoul to Singapore, whose businesses depend on stable supply chains, made a clear and rational calculation. Reliability will always trump patriotism. They simply shifted their orders north, securing their grain from a partner they could count on. The result is stark, and the scoreboard doesn't lie. Year to date, Canadian corn exports to Asia are up a staggering 42%. Over the same period, U.S. shipments to the same region are down a catastrophic 94%. This is an undeniable victory for Canadian strategy and a profound self-inflicted loss for the United States. Responsibility for this debacle sits squarely on both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue, but the fingerprints on the very first move, the action that set this entire disastrous chain of events in motion, undeniably belong to the White House. The administration pitched the 25% tariff as a piece of essential leverage, a blunt instrument needed to force Canada to curb undocumented border crossings and to reshore manufacturing jobs back to the United States. Inside their own strategy memos, American agriculture was coldly listed as acceptable collateral. The working assumption was that American farmers, famously resilient and patriotic, would simply endure a period of short-term pain for the sake of achieving these grand, long-term structural wins. Except the pain is no longer short-term. It is becoming chronic and potentially permanent. Corn is not like a factory. You can't just turn it off and on. It's a perennial crop cycle, a long game built on trust. Once you lose a major customer, once that trust is broken, you may not win them back for a decade, if you can win them back at all. China, which had already learned its lesson and prudently diversified its agricultural suppliers to Brazil after the 2018 trade war, simply turned the final spigot off on U.S. corn. Japan's massive feed mills, famously pragmatic and focused on stability, have now locked in 3-year supply contracts with Canada, even agreeing to a modest premium over U.S. offers. Those contracts will run well past the next U.S. presidential term, cementing Canada's new position as the preferred supplier. That acceptable collateral is no longer just acceptable, it is a permanent wound on our agricultural landscape. Corn isn't just another crop, it's the anchor commodity for the entire agricultural economy. Soybeans, wheat, even the beef industry through distiller grains, they are all tied to the fate of corn. When the corn market tanks, when its profitability completely collapses, a predictable wave of disruption follows. Farmers making rational individual decisions just to survive inevitably plant more soybeans because they require less nitrogen fertilizer, a less expensive input. But what starts as a smart choice for one farmer quickly becomes a macro tsunami when thousands of farmers do it at once. Soybean futures have already slid 15% since April, simply on the forecast of these expanded planting acres, creating a second commodity crisis on top of the first. Meanwhile, as ethanol plants shut down, the supply of their primary byproduct, dried distillers grains, or DDGs, a key ingredient in cattle feed, dries up. So, what's the consequence of that? American feedlots are now importing more corn from Brazil, shipping it all the way to New Orleans at a landed price that is still astonishingly cheaper than buying domestic bushels from just up the river. Picture that absurdity for a moment. U.S. livestock are eating Brazilian corn unloaded on a Mississippi River dock, while perfectly good Iowa corn rots in bins just 200 miles away because a series of political decisions made it too expensive to move and sell. The contradiction would be almost comical if it weren't actively bankrupting people and tearing apart the fabric of rural livelihoods. Policy created this gaping hole, and therefore only policy can dig us out. But the clock, as always, is a cruel and unforgiving judge. First, The 25% tariff on Canadian fertilizer must be eliminated immediately today. Every single week it stays in place, more growers are forced to lock in their fall input orders at these artificially inflated prices, digging themselves deeper into a hole of debt they may never escape from. Second, we have to restore funding for our own inspection services fully and quickly so that labs can process shipping containers in days, not weeks. This would put an end to the absurd late paperwork rejections that are nothing more than a non-tariff barrier of our own making. Third, we must begin negotiations for a phased but swift removal of the retaliatory tariffs with Canada and Mexico. In exchange, we can work to reintegrate North American standards on everything from pesticides to trucking rules, which would rebuild the trust and efficiency that was lost. Fourth, and this is a longer-term strategy, but absolutely vital for our future competitiveness, we must create and fund a robust national low-carbon grain initiative. This is the only way U.S. corn can genuinely compete on the metrics that global buyers increasingly value: sustainability, quality, and environmental stewardship, instead of being forced into a desperate race to the absolute bottom on price. Canada won this round because they sold a premium, identity-preserved product with the most productive soil in the world. There is no reason we cannot and should not be doing the same. If this story makes you furious, good. It should. This is not an abstract economic debate. It's a story of self-inflicted wounds. Hit the share button, and if you live in a rural area, drop your own county's unemployment or business closure numbers in the comments below. Tag the lawmakers who still stubbornly insist that tariffs are some kind of free lunch paid for by other countries, and subscribe for our weekly breakdowns on how trade policy collides with real life, because the next fight, the next casualty list, is already being written for soybeans and dairy, and our farmers and our communities deserve to know the real score. A trade war is often advertised as a quick, decisive action, a tactical shove that forces the other side to blink. But here in corn country, it didn't play out that way at all. It transformed into a slow-motion wrecking ball, swinging relentlessly, long after the politicians in Washington had moved on and declared some abstract victory. 94% of our export demand gone. $1.40 clipped off the value of every single bushel. Rural towns hemorrhaging the jobs that held them together. These are not just statistics for a cable news chyron. They are the lived, painful reality for hundreds of thousands of Americans who did nothing wrong except plant the seeds they were told for decades the world would always want to buy. The good news, if there is any to be found in this wreckage, is that markets are fluid. Trust, while much harder to earn than to lose, is not impossible to reclaim. We must tear down these self-harming tariffs, invest wisely in the sustainable production the world is asking for, and allow American farmers to once again do what they do best: confidently and profitably feed the planet. The alternative, the path we are currently on, is to keep cheering for a trade war that has already declared its real and undeniable casualties.